At 10:40 in the morning on June 25th, 2009, Michael Jackson finally fell asleep. He had been awake for the entire night. He had been begging for help since 1 in the morning. His body had been pumped full of Valium and Ativan and versed across 9 hours of desperation, while he lay in his bed at the Carolwood Drive mansion, unable to achieve the one thing his body needed most. Sleep. Real sleep. The kind that does not require a needle and a drip line and a physician sitting beside your bed in what should have been the middle of the night. At 10:40 in the morning, the drug that finally put him under was propofol, the white liquid anesthetic used in surgical suites around the world. The drug that requires continuous monitoring of blood, oxygen, and respiratory function, and cardiac rhythm by trained personnel with emergency equipment immediately available. The drug that Michael Jackson had been calling his milk for months because it was the only thing that worked. The drug that Conrad Murray administered through an intravenous line in a private bedroom in a rented mansion with no pulse oximeter properly functioning, and no capnography, and no emergency airway equipment, and no anesthesiologist present. At some point between 10:50 and 11 that morning, Michael Jackson stopped breathing. Conrad Murray was not in the room. What happened in the 89 minutes between the moment Murray left that bedroom and the moment paramedics finally walked through the door is one of the most documented and most disturbing sequences of events in the history of celebrity medicine. Every minute of it is supported by phone records and court testimony and forensic evidence and the accounts of witnesses who were present. And every minute of it raises the same question that millions of people around the world have been asking for more than 15 years. How did this happen? To answer that question properly, you have to begin not on the morning of June 25th, but months earlier, because the events of that morning did not emerge from nothing. They were the endpoint of a trajectory that had been building for a long time, and that everyone around Michael Jackson could see building even if nobody with the authority to stop it chose to intervene. Michael Jackson, at 50 years old, was a man carrying decades of physical damage. His body had been a professional instrument since before he was old enough to attend school. The physical demands of his performance style were extreme. The moonwalk and the spins and the high-energy choreography that defined his stage presence for 30 years required a level of physical output that took a measurable and cumulative toll on his joints and his back and his overall physical resilience. By 2009, he was managing chronic pain from injuries sustained across a career that had begun in the 1960s. The insomnia was the most immediate crisis. He had battled it for years, and by the period of This Is It rehearsals, it had become severe enough that normal life was essentially impossible without pharmaceutical intervention. He had told people close to him that he would pay whatever it cost for one genuine night of peaceful sleep. That statement was not hyperbole. It was a description of someone who had lost the ability to do something that most people take entirely for granted. The financial pressure, compounding everything, was real and specific. His debts at the time of his death were estimated at over $400 million. The This Is It residency at the O2 Arena in London was not simply a comeback. It was a financial lifeline. 50 sold-out shows generating hundreds of millions of dollars. The pressure to be ready to perform, to be physically capable of delivering what he had sold to the public, was enormous, and it was relentless, and it had no release valve. Conrad Murray entered this situation in 2008. A cardiologist, not an anesthesiologist, not a sleep specialist, not a physician with any training in the specific pharmacology of the substances he would eventually be administering. He was hired at $150,000 per month with a job description that amounted to keeping Michael Jackson functional enough to complete the This Is It rehearsals and eventually perform the shows. The propofol arrangement did not begin immediately. Murray tried other approaches first, benzodiazepines and other sedatives that carry their own risks, but that fall within something closer to conventional medical practice for insomnia management. They did not produce the results Michael needed. He had likely developed significant tolerance to conventional sedatives through years of use. What he wanted was propofol, because propofol worked. It produced the deep unconsciousness that his brain registered as genuine rest, even though medical professionals debate whether propofol-induced sedation produces the restorative neurological effects of natural sleep. Murray began administering propofol to Michael Jackson in a private home setting. Every medical professional who testified at the subsequent trial was unequivocal about how far outside standard medical practice this was. Propofol in a clinical setting requires continuous monitoring of multiple vital signs simultaneously. It requires the immediate availability of airway management equipment. It requires personnel trained in recognizing and responding to the respiratory depression that propofol can cause within seconds of administration. None of those safety requirements were present in the bedroom at Carolwood Drive on the night of June 24th into the morning of June 25th. What was present was a pulse oximeter that Murray later testified he was not confident was working correctly, a physician who would subsequently leave his patient alone, and phone records that documented exactly what he did instead of staying. The night of June 24th began around 1 in the morning when Michael returned from rehearsals. The testimony about what followed comes primarily from Murray himself during the criminal trial, and from the phone records and forensic evidence that contradicted significant portions of his account. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, Murray administered 10 milligrams of Valium. Michael told him it was not working. At 2 in the morning, Murray injected 2 milligrams of lorazepam intravenously. Michael remained awake. At 3 in the morning, another injection, 2 milligrams of midazolam. His breathing was shallow, but he could not sleep. By 5 in the morning, another dose of lorazepam. At 7:30, another injection of midazolam. The sun had risen over Los Angeles. Michael Jackson had been in bed for over 6 hours, receiving a series of sedative medications through an intravenous line, and he was still awake, still asking for help, still saying in a voice that witnesses described as broken and childlike that he needed sleep, that he had rehearsals, that he could not do this anymore. At approximately 10:40 in the morning, Murray administered 25 milligrams of propofol mixed with lidocaine to reduce the burning sensation in the vein. Within minutes, Michael's body finally relaxed. His breathing became deep and steady. His face, according to the accounts of people who were present, looked peaceful in a way it had not looked in a very long time. He was finally asleep. Murray sat beside him for a period of time. Then he stood up and left the room. What happened next is where the phone records become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case, because they contradict Murray's account in a way that no amount of courtroom testimony could overcome. Murray told investigators he left Michael for approximately 2 minutes to use the bathroom. The phone records showed that between 11:07 and 11:51, Murray made and received a series of personal phone calls that lasted a total of approximately 45 minutes. One of those calls was to his girlfriend. Michael Jackson was alone and unconscious in the bedroom while his personal physician was on the phone for the better part of an hour. At some point during that period, Michael stopped breathing. When Murray returned to the bedroom, the man he had left sleeping was no longer breathing. His eyes were open but unfocused. His skin color had changed. His chest was not moving. What Murray did next is where the negligence that the jury ultimately found was clearest. The standard response when a physician discovers a patient not breathing is immediate emergency call. Get trained personnel with appropriate equipment to the scene as fast as possible, because every second without oxygen is brain cells dying, and every minute without oxygen is the difference between survival and death. Murray did not call emergency services. He attempted CPR. He performed it on the bed rather than on a hard floor, which significantly reduces the effectiveness of chest compressions because a soft surface absorbs the force rather than allowing it to travel through the sternum to the heart. He injected flumazenil to attempt to reverse the effects of the benzodiazepines. Michael did not respond. He made more phone calls. The timeline of those calls is documented in the phone records that were presented at trial. Between 11:51 and 12:21, when 911 was finally called, Murray spoke to multiple people, including members of the household staff. He summoned security guard Alberto Alvarez to the room. What Alvarez found when he entered that bedroom has been described in his trial testimony in detail that is difficult to process even now. Michael Jackson was lying on the bed motionless, an IV line still in his arm, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling, his skin pale. The scene having all the characteristics of a medical emergency that had been in progress for a significant period of time without professional intervention. Alvarez testified that Murray's first instruction to him was not to call for help. It was to help remove propofol bottles and medical equipment from the nightstand and conceal them before emergency services were contacted. Murray later disputed portions of this account, but the jury found Alvarez's testimony credible. At 12:21 in the afternoon, nearly 90 minutes after Michael was found not breathing, emergency services were finally called. The 911 recording captures a scene of chaos and desperation, and a security guard struggling to communicate the nature of the emergency, while Murray's voice can be heard in the background. Paramedics arrived at 12:26. What they encountered was a man in full cardiac arrest whose body temperature and the condition of his pupils indicated he had been without adequate oxygen for an extended period. They worked on him at the scene before transporting him. They continued working on him in the ambulance. He arrived at Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center at 1:13 in the afternoon. At 2:26, the medical team stopped. Every available intervention had been attempted. The damage from oxygen deprivation was irreversible. Michael Joseph Jackson was pronounced dead at 50 years old. The investigation that followed moved quickly in the direction that the evidence pointed. Conrad Murray was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter. The trial in 2011 was one of the most intensively covered legal proceedings of the decade. The prosecution's case rested on 3 central arguments. First, Murray had administered a powerful anesthetic in a setting that lacked every safety requirement the medical standard of care demands for propofol use. Second, when he discovered his patient was not breathing, he failed to immediately call emergency services, and instead made personal phone calls and allegedly attempted to conceal evidence of the propofol administration. Third, the 90-minute delay in calling for help was the direct cause of the brain damage from oxygen deprivation that made resuscitation impossible. The defense argued that Michael Jackson had self-administered an additional dose of propofol while Murray was out of the room, and that this was the immediate cause of death. The prosecution's medical experts testified that the evidence did not support this account, and that even if it were true, Murray's abandonment of his patient without proper monitoring was itself the critical failure that turned an overdose into a death. The jury deliberated for approximately 9 hours before returning a guilty verdict on November 29, 2011. The judge sentencing Murray used language that was direct and unambiguous. He told Murray he was a disgrace to the medical profession. He sentenced him to 4 years in prison, which was the maximum allowed under California law for the charge. Murray served 2 years before being released on good behavior. His medical licenses were subsequently revoked in California, Texas, and Nevada. The sentence produced an immediate and worldwide reaction from Michael Jackson's fan base that has not substantially moderated in the years since. The maximum sentence for the charge was 4 years. The charge was involuntary manslaughter rather than a more serious homicide offense. Murray was free before Michael Jackson's children finished grieving in any meaningful way. For the people who loved Michael Jackson, the legal resolution felt profoundly inadequate to the magnitude of what had been lost. Conrad Murray did not disappear after his release. He gave interviews. He appeared in documentaries. His most notable post-conviction appearance was a 2013 interview in which he discussed the events of June 25, 2009 in detail. The interview is remarkable primarily for what it reveals about Murray's internal relationship to the events he was convicted of causing. His posture throughout the interview is described by observers as composed and almost clinical. His eye contact was steady. His hands were still. His voice did not waver in any way that suggested genuine anguish. He expressed sorrow for the loss in language that was measured and professional. He acknowledged Michael's suffering and his desperation for sleep. He described himself as a physician trying to help a patient who was in genuine distress. What he did not do was accept responsibility in any meaningful terms. He did not say that administering propofol in a private home without proper monitoring equipment was wrong. He did not acknowledge that leaving his patient alone for 45 minutes while making personal phone calls was a failure of the most basic duty of care. He framed the events in ways that positioned Michael's own insistence on propofol as the driving force and himself as a reluctant participant trying to accommodate a suffering patient's needs. The contrast between that framing and the documented facts of what happened in that bedroom is what continued to fuel the anger of Michael's fans and the broader public. A patient cannot drive a physician to administer a drug that the physician knows requires monitoring equipment that is not present in the room. A physician who has taken on the responsibility of another person's medical care cannot leave that person alone and unconscious while making personal phone calls. A physician who discovers his unconscious patient is not breathing cannot spend the next 90 minutes doing anything other than calling emergency services immediately. These are not complicated ethical questions. They are foundational requirements of medical practice that Conrad Murray did not meet. In the years since his release, Murray has attempted to rebuild some form of professional identity. He has spoken about wellness, consulting, and health services. He has maintained publicly that he bears no real culpability for what happened. He has continued to discuss Michael with a combination of apparent respect and consistent deflection of personal responsibility. Michael's 3 children, Prince and Paris and Blanket, grew up in the shadow of June 25, 2009. They have spoken publicly at different times about their grief and about carrying their father's legacy forward. Paris Jackson has spoken about the loss in terms that describe it as the defining trauma of her life. All 3 have navigated the particular difficulty of being the children of the most famous person in the world, while also being the children of someone who died in circumstances that remained actively contested in public for years afterward. The conspiracy theories that surround Michael Jackson's death have never fully receded. They are fed partly by genuine unanswered questions and partly by the specific circumstances of who stood to benefit from various outcomes connected to his estate and his music catalog. The questions that remain genuinely unresolved are distinct from the speculation. Why did Murray leave his patient alone without functioning monitoring equipment? Why did he make personal phone calls for 45 minutes rather than returning to check on a patient who was under a powerful anesthetic? Why was his first response on discovering Michael unresponsive to make more phone calls and allegedly attempt to conceal evidence rather than to call for help immediately? These questions were central to the prosecution's case, and the jury found the answers consistent with criminal negligence. But criminal negligence and deliberate intent are different things, and the trial did not resolve the question of whether Murray's choices on that morning reflected panic or calculation. The broader questions about who bears responsibility beyond Murray are ones the legal system did not fully engage. The concert promoters who had a financial interest in Michael's performance had been aware that he was struggling physically during rehearsals. The people in Michael's professional life who were managing his career and his finances had access to information about his condition. The pressure that was being placed on a 50-year-old man to perform 50 consecutive sold-out concerts was pressure that came from specific sources with specific financial interests. None of those questions were resolved in the involuntary manslaughter conviction of Conrad Murray. What the documented record establishes with certainty is this: Michael Jackson was a man in genuine physical and psychological distress in the final period of his life. The insomnia was real, and it was severe. The pain was real. The financial pressure was real. The fear of failing publicly was real. He sought help from the person he had employed and trusted to provide it. Conrad Murray failed him in ways that were specific and documented and ultimately criminal. Whether that failure was the product of negligence alone or of something more deliberate is a question the evidence does not definitively answer. What the evidence does answer is that the choices Murray made on the morning of June 25, 2009, created the conditions in which Michael Jackson's death became inevitable. The pulse oximeter that was not functioning properly, the monitoring equipment that was absent, the 45 minutes on the phone, the 90-minute delay in calling for help, the alleged concealment of evidence. Each of these choices removed one more possibility of a different outcome. By the time paramedics walked through the door of the bedroom at Carolwood Drive, the damage had been done. By the time the ambulance reached UCLA Medical Center, the damage was irreversible. By the time the medical team made the decision at 2:26 in the afternoon, the only question remaining was the formal one. Michael Jackson spent 50 years giving the world something extraordinary. His death at the endpoint of that journey took place in a private bedroom in the most ordinary kind of failure, not a public tragedy witnessed by thousands, a quiet one. A man in a bed asking for help, a physician who left the room, a phone that kept ringing, and 89 minutes that the people who loved him will spend the rest of their lives wishing had gone differently.